I think when people usually hear the term slavery, they immediately think of something that was happening a long time ago or that happens in places that they usually wouldn't come across in their daily lives. But actually, today we have more people in conditions of modern slavery than we have at any time in history. Essentially, when we're talking about modern slavery, what we're talking about is people who are trapped against their will and forced to work in circumstances where they can't escape, where there's coercive practices being used on them, whether it's they're in conditions of debt bondage where they're paying for a job, or they're being treated in really inhumane circumstances with their passports being taken from them. There's a myriad of different circumstances that can create slavery, but it's really the most egregious forms of labour rights violations. Hi, my name is Freya Dinshaw and I'm a senior lawyer at Human Rights Law Centre. I was really excited when I saw the Community Fellows program putting out applications for people to become involved because I'm a lawyer, I do casework and also law reform and policy work, but the opportunity to work with academics at Melbourne University and explore some of the issues we were working around in greater depth and carve out space to think through some of the issues I was facing in my work was a really good opportunity, and that's why I applied for the program. One of the great benefits of participating in the Community Fellowship program was that I was lucky enough to work with a supervisor from Melbourne Law School, Professor Susan Kneebone, who was brilliant to work with, and I learned a lot from her in terms of some of the academic research methods, how to do things like putting in an ethics application, and it was really brilliant to work with like a leader in the field of migration. In Australia, there's obviously a number of different classes of visas for people who are called temporary migrants or people who don't have permanent visas here in Australia. And people on the bridging visa E, which was what we focused on in our research, are people who've come from offshore detention centres. So we're talking about Manus Island and Nauru that were set up in 2013, 2014 to deal with people who are arriving in Australia seeking safety by boat and held offshore. Our research focused on a small group of people who were lifted from that situation of detention at the time and placed on a 6-month rolling bridging visa E, and within that period they didn't have housing security, they didn't have the same level of welfare benefits that they previously had, but they did have work rights. And so for people who'd come to Australia perhaps with limited English, perhaps with medical issues or mental health issues, who had been out of the workplace for a long time through no reason of their own but because they had to flee danger in their home countries, were suddenly forced in order to survive to search for employment. And what that creates is a situation where very vulnerable people can be exploited by unscrupulous employers in some circumstances. As part of our research, we reached out to several people who were on bridging visa E's, and one of the people we spoke to, Ali, was a man who'd come to Australia seeking safety, was placed on this visa and told us about the struggles that he'd found trying to find work. He would try and apply somewhere to work, or a friend would say, come and work, with me, there's work going, and employers would look and say, what, you're only here for 6 months, like what am I giving you work for? And so he found that trying to convince anyone to give him paid work was a real challenge. And then when he eventually was able to find work, it was cash in hand, it was less than the minimum wage. We also spoke to advocates who told us about people they'd worked with who'd worked for months and months without any pay. In our research, we've recommended that the government should look at 3 reforms in order to start to address this problem. The first is to give people who have been in Australia for this period of time a path to permanency for these people who have been within the community, working, contributing. The second reform is to ensure that there's some sort of access to justice for people who are exploited that are on temporary work visas. It's essential that people don't face retaliation for taking action to try and access justice when they are exploited at work, regardless of their visa status. And thirdly, the government should look to the role of business in this, reforming the Modern Slavery Act so that it requires companies to take action on modern slavery rather than just putting in a public statement year on year is a really important reform that we would like to see as well.